Okay, the single most important thing I'm going to tell you today, I am not David Bianco. Why do you care? He blew out his Achilles tendon after being accepted to RSA, and now I'm giving his talk on his behalf. So, if you hate this talk, don't hate me personally, hate David Bianco, much easier. He's a wonderful human being, he'll be here, he's available for questions, emails, he's very excited, so hopefully I do his work justice. But if you do have any questions, I should know them, but if I don't, I'll probably defer and get you an answer later on from Mr. Bianco. So disclaimer, RSA made me put this up here. Usually I tell you not to buy stock in anything I say, but I think in this case it is more, I don't represent RSA, and if I say something horrible, don't blame this gentleman in the front or the lovely AV tech in the back left. It's not their fault that I swear. Moving on. The origin of this project is pretty easy. On the team that I run, Surge, which is a part of Splunk, we're a strategic cybersecurity research and development team there. We try to work on big problems, and we try to work on big data, because unlike the rest of you, I have an unlimited free Splunk license. So we try to do some pretty incredible things with it, and then return those results to the community. David joined us about a year ago, I think that's about right, a year ago from Target, and he wanted to do a big, interesting project. And one of the things he's really worked on in his career was certificate transparency. But he'd only done it more in a real stream of certificate registrations, real-time stream, rather than, hey, let's look at this holistically across time. So for this first project, he said, okay, what could I do if I downloaded just about every certificate transparency or cert on the internet? And we really look at this as the why we do projects. So one of the aspects of my team is we always start every research project with a hypothesis, and then we start working backwards through that. So in this case, the problem statement that David came through and why he felt it was useful and cool to investigate was basically, this has big custodiat episos custodis energy. I did not take Latin in class, and I'm really hoping I didn't say something very vulgar in Latin, so we'll have to check with him later on that. But the general concept here is, here's the hypothesis. We wanted to go through and see how trustworthy the internet was of our trust if we worked backwards in time, looking at malicious domains and certificates across everything that's been registered and grouped them with CAs and trusts. Our team does not work in a vacuum. We're very proud of that. So here's three lovely human beings who contributed widely to this. Mikkel Björklund, who developed a lot of the back-end infrastructure. When you start playing with big data, you have big problems, and we did. So Mikkel was able to actually take care of a lot of the plumbing. For those of you who are smiling, you probably know the old adage of data sciencery, which is you're not a data scientist, you're a data janitor who happens to understand math. So Mikkel helped us along with that. Our two data scientists who actually worked on the analysis quite a bit, Kelsey Bourne and Philip Dreiger, both of them lovely human beings, and they provided a lot of assistance for some of the more complicated mathematical equations that we use that I will not be talking about in depth. However, if you do have any questions, Dave is more than welcome to help out. And he also says, thanks to Ryan Kovar, the best boss in the world. I didn't write that, he did, I swear to God. So there we go. In theory, this is how it all worked. Data times intel equals insight. It's never quite that easy, right? So we wanted to download every TLS certificate we could find on the internet, put them into Splunk, and then compare them with the ones that are bad versus the ones that are good, and then group them by CAs and issuers. On, very nice little napkin math, sounds pretty easy. 4 months of work later, now we're speaking at RSA. Let's do a quick review of key web PKI concepts to make sure everyone is able to follow along. It's okay if you haven't looked at this for 10 years or 15 years or 1 year or 6 months. We're going to go over the high-level parts of it. And then for those of you who know more, you can make fun of my lack of knowledge of elliptical curves. The general concept when you have a cert is there is a subject, right? These are all key value pairs within the cert. These are things that we started looking at. So whose cert is this specifically? Who created the cert? Who is the issuer? And then we have the actual certificate fields and details. So what other names are within this area? What are the alternative names? Can I trust this cert? Is the cert authority, the cert trust, kind of going all the way through for the chain? And then who says I can trust it? Because of course, all of this is dependent upon this idea of root certificate authorities that we have all put our trust into, right? There's very few, by comparison, root certificate authorities compared to issuers. And this is really at the crux of it. Do some root CAs or do some issuers give more bad things than others, and in the future, possibly why? So most people think that they know how browsers validate certificates. I thought I did, and part of David's work was really validating that against subject matter experts. Personally, I've been doing security for about 20, 25 years now, mostly within the reference of nation-state hunting. One of my favorite things in the world is pivoting on SSL certificates. Some of you may be familiar with Mark Parsons' work from 2016 that he presented at SANS CTI. A former colleague and I presented on something similar that extended that work in 2017. I love SSL certificates, right? Many of you know David Bianco for Pyramid of Pain. SSL certificate hashes are about midway up because they're something that people just reuse quite a bit. But I didn't know really much about how they were generated, and that's something David went through quite a bit. So you may not know about CRLs and OCSP, and a lot of people have never heard of CT, or certificate transparency. And there's even a lot more to that, right? The constraints of processing to ensure the certificate is presented and used, the functions that the issuer is intended correctly, and it's incredibly weird. It's hard to find comprehensive documentation on this that is applicable to every single certificate authority. RFCs are wonderful, and sometimes they're adopted widely, and sometimes they're adopted and used-ish. And that's part of what David found as we went through. I'm not going to go through this very complicated diagram because A, you can't read it, and B, it's just supposed to look really impressively difficult. So you're like, oh God, this is difficult. This is the easy diagram. But the general concept is this. Certificate transparency goes back to 2011 with Komodo and the DigiNotar breaches. The first draft was actually submitted to IETF by Google researchers in 2012, and then Google launched its first certificate transparency logging methodology in 2013. And then Chrome began actually requiring certificate transparency for some certificates in 2015, but by 2018, they demanded that every CA be completely transparent. And of course, Chrome is a giant portion of the browsing market, either from its actual self or Chromium as a backend. So some basic statistics about our certificate data set, which I think is important. We found 5 billion unique SSL certificates. Of that 5 billion, does anyone want to guess where you kind of go to find out the telephone list for root CAs? We couldn't really find one either. The easiest way to do it was actually to look through and just find all the places that people are defining root CAs within the certificate. 78,000 of these CAs, and then, as we said, 15 certificate transparency loggings. So these are services that are actually doing the real-time streaming, and that's actually where we went back and we downloaded these. Some have APIs, some are static downloads, some we actually had to reach out and get more information from them, and they provided it, and then we ingested it all into Splunk, because that's where we work, and like I said, I have an unlimited license, so let's have fun. This is a diagram to show the relationship between the issuing CAs and their associated roots. Now, with the lights, it's a little hard, but it was really hard to look at regardless of. This is using Giphy, not Giphy, I can't remember. Anyway, some things to note. Most issuers are associated with a single root. Roots with a small number of different issuers are common, and the different issuers often reflect the varying levels of identity verification for issued certificates. Now, most of the clusters of issuers and roots are independents of others, right? So they're completely unique, they all have their own relationships, and you can tell that they're separate when we look at this with this visualization. But if you zoom in on a single cluster, or a single typical cluster of multiple issuers in a single root CA, brighter nodes reflect the increased risk relative to their peers, and we'll talk about what that risk was later on. But they don't necessarily mean they are risky, it just means that they have more risk comparatively, right? So that could be a difference of 1 to 2, not necessarily that they're really bad, just that they are more bad than their friends. There's nothing especially important to see about this graph, except the pattern is typical. It didn't matter where we looked, this was pretty much the same. In this case, the root CA is Deutsche Telekom root CA2. That's just one of the roots they have for Deutsche Telekom. And all the nodes are their customers who have their own issuing CAs. So most of these are German universities who have primarily chosen to use that root CA. And when we dug into many of these different, the 497 root CAs, it pretty much always looked like this. Portion of the diagram shows the number of root CAs operated by Sectigo, also known as Komodo, also known as AdTrust. Some issuers have changed their root CAs. Not every root is a Sectigo root, but most of them are. The high level of the interconnectedness is partly because some of the routes, the root CAs are cross-signed, but this is mostly because many of the issuers from Comodo and AdTrust switched from a Comodo AdTrust route to a proper Sectigo route as Sectigo consolidated their operations after acquisition. I'm kind of a nerdy policy sometimes, and I'm a huge history buff. So one aspect I like this is like we have this rich history within the internet that none of us really know and we don't see because of these mergers and acquisitions. As someone who's focused on nation state adversaries for most of my life, when you start looking back at something like SolarWinds and you have to say like, hey, let's go back 4, 5, 6, 7 years worth of data, suddenly this becomes relevant, right? Because what you saw and defined temporally in 2018 from Mandiant in a threat report suddenly may still be the same in 2022, but the names have changed because of the M&A and you've lost that contextual history. So I find this nerdily interesting from my point of view. It had nothing to do with David's work, but I really glommed on this part. Here is how about the stats. So as we said, we collected 2 things. One, we collected a whole bunch of digital certificates and we went to put that into Splunk. And then we needed something to compare that to because we wanted to find out if any of these CAs and issuers had inherently bad or untrustworthy things. So we had 185 million IOCs that we went through, which tells you the scope of the problem that we have in our industry, frankly. If I was able to find 185 million IOCs to use in research, I'm not even sure Splunk could handle that in our SIM, so good luck to the rest of the world blocking 185 million. And we primarily got this from 7 different providers, of whom we were very happy, and I'll talk about in a second. We did try to counteract bias as much as we could. Obviously, as Americans, we have a lot of connections within the traditional groups that provide threat intel here, but we did reach across borders and try to find people who didn't work in nation state in different groups. I'll talk about that in a second. And we only use the intel based on actual observation. So for example, one of our sources used extensive predictions of maliciousness based on their own data science models, or ML models. But those models without the context of their other data weren't as useful for us. So we actually cut a significant portion of that data. So every one of these 185 had a proven bad thing that happened with them associated. So 185 million IOCs, each one, it wasn't predicted, it was verified bad by these trusted advisors. And we didn't want to use that data from the other organization because we didn't think it'd be fair to the other groups as well. So with that in mind, I want to give a thanks. You'll notice that we have folks like Domain Tools. They provided a huge amount of the data, which was really great. They were wonderful to work with. Group IB, the Paranoids, if you're not familiar with them, Yahoo, I think they were Verizon when we started. Now they're Yahoo again, possibly. First, which is a wonderful open organization, and then JP Cert. JP Cert is one of the top certs in the world. They have released phenomenal data. Really recommend looking at anything they push out. And we also had other people that just didn't want to be recognized. They provided it in the Secret Squirrel Network, and they said, here's our data, you can trust it, but sweet God, don't say my name out loud. So, zipped. David has a good joke here as a Marvel guy, I guess. If Surge team is Splunk Vengers, then I guess these are the X-Men and the Guardians of the Galaxy for domains and for this project. So very happy and very proud to work with these wonderful folks and wanted to make sure that we recognize that. The one thing I'll be very specific here is we received FQDNs and domains from these providers. Some of them have other great information. We just didn't need it for this project. So it's important to know, and we fully acknowledge this as something very important to our process, that our analysis wasn't perfect. We would like to share. We have a motto on our team of fail less. Every day you fail. And the only true failure is not sharing with other people for your research. So as we went through this, we want to tell you where we failed and then hopefully where we succeeded. So first off, big data is actually big data. You start dealing with terabytes and terabytes of data. Every time you screw up an analysis pipeline, you have to wait another week for everything to reprocess. And that really slows you down. It took us actual months to download all the data to get it from the CTLs. We ran into issues where folks were like, hey, sure, you can have our API access. And then we'd get a call a week later like, sweet Jesus, what have you done? And we said, yeah, we're downloading everything. They're like, yeah, but we didn't take everything. We're like, no, we want it all, total, everything. So then we'd run into things like, oh, well, can you set up an S3 bucket? And can we go, absolutely. And then you have to get all the agreements signed. Anyway, it extends the project quite a bit. So as you go through, if you ever start working on a project like this, just realize that in a world where big data is thrown around casually, when you actually start trying to move terabytes and terabytes of data across APIs, you run into big problems, as we found out. Also, furthermore, although there are RFCs, there's IETF, SSL certificates are not universally well filled out. So the things that you're thinking that will be in a certificate are not necessarily always in them. And then you have to deal with what that means and how you kind of go through that, which is something I experienced in some previous work of building ML models based off of issuer names. David found it as well as we went through again. The Intel into certificate subjects isn't as straightforward. So the concept here would be we're looking for a bad domain, and we want to match that in the subject field, but sometimes that's an FQDN, sometimes that's a domain. Well, if you have an FQDN in the subject field and you're only matching on a domain, now you have to do further parsing and go through every single one of these 5 billion certificates to make sure you're getting down to regexing of domains. For anyone here who's ever tried to make sure that you have an FQDN TLD, I don't know how many TLDs were added this week, but probably 30. They keep adding and changing, so it's an ongoing problem that we had to deal with. And then as we said, one real problem that we did not expect was how vastly different 497 CAs, root CAs, and some of them could have 1 billion domains and some could have 12. So when you start trying to statistically say like, oh, this CA is worse than this CA, that's a very difficult mathematical problem because the sample size of 1 billion to 12 kind of makes that completely pointless. So not something we were expecting. I find this interesting, just if anyone does a project similar like this in the future, here's some of the areas that we ran into. One thing that David said is he wanted to give a shout out to the Axeman tool from CaliDog. Apparently that was a real advantage to kind of going through and parsing. So hopefully you're able to see some of this. If not, I'm going to be calling this out visually. The riskiest root CAs in a single pool. At first, our analysis we thought was going to be pretty simple. Just calculate the risky percentages and look for outliers. Even I, who failed first grade math, actual story, I have a photo, happy to share it later on. Miss Johnson, I hope you die, who fails a first grader in math. Anyway, even I could figure that out. I can understand Z-scores. But as we said, it was completely unfair when you started looking at the total number of certificates used by CAs. If you've never dealt with the idea of a Z-score is simply how many standard deviations from the mean something is, right? If you're familiar with the Gaussian distribution of data, right, it kind of looks like a mountain. You'll see this a lot with the average height of someone, right? Like average height of an American male is 5'10", so that would be 0. One deviation to the negative 1 deviation might be 5'7". Plus 1 deviation might be 6'1", right? That's kind of how a standard deviation works. So the Z-score would be 1 or -1. When we computed a Z-score of each root based on the percentage of risky certs issued, where at least one subject or SAN matched in the range of 3 to -3. So any CA with a Z-score greater or equal to 3, we say is a risky outlier. While any Z-score with a negative or less than or equal to -3 is a trusty outlier. We computed the risky percents for each certificate authority and then sorted these Z-score to obtain the most and least risky rankings. So by far, the riskiest CA, and once again, I am going to call out specific formal nouns, which terrifies my legal team. But what we're saying here is this is just based off our data that anyone can replicate. There's no maliciousness here ascribed. It's just from the findings that we're seeing on the internet. The riskiest CA we saw was ISRG root X2, run by, and does anyone have a guess who runs that root? There we go. Man in the front actually knows more than I do probably about this. Let's Encrypt obviously gives way more certificates than any other organization in the world. Which then causes the problem that we'll talk about in a little later. But they only have 2 certs for that root CA of ISRG. So one of their certificates is bad and the other is good. So they have a 50% chance of being bad. That's not really very helpful to people for our data analysis. So surely GoDaddy root certificate authority, G2 should be ranked much higher than ISRG, but sadly no, math is a cruel mistress. Large imbalances like this make for straightforward computing pretty easily, and that's when we brought in the big guns with folks who have PhDs in math. So, let's see, that would have been useful if I'd known that slide build. There we go. Okay, so because there's so many root CAs and because roots have so many multiple issuers with different owners and policies, we also wanted to look at trust at an issuer level. Again, the riskiest issuers were only responsible for a handful of certificates. The TrustOcean encryption 365 Pro SSL CA, which I really think a lot of companies be better marketing for their names, if I'm honest, issuer is the only one that has a substantial number of certificates, but once again, not really fair to compare 10,611 versus 2, 4, 2, and 2. So this kind of pulls back to some of the problems we had with the data analysis. And since I said imbalance makes things look wrong and bad, let's look at this imbalance. First off, please notice this is a logarithmic scale on the y-axis. So it goes 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, 1 million, 10 million, and 100 million. So on the far top is 100 million, and the far bottom right is less than 9. So you can see just a wild visual difference here. 500 of our root CAs are basically represented here. 497, if I remember earlier. And come on, click. Okay. Same type of graph, but for the number of certs directly issued, the y-axis, by each issuing CA, the x-axis. And the drop-off here is shockingly much higher. Once again, logarithmic. So this is technically truncated because we literally couldn't fit it on a graph. I think we would have had to go into the IMAX theater, just kind of really show the true scale. David plotted the first 10,000 issuers, but we got into the single certificate issuer threshold much, much earlier. So we have 78,000 unique issuing CAs, and we're only showing 10,000 here. To make it fair and get reliable, David did something I almost fired him for, a pie chart. I hate them. I think it's a horrible way to visualize, and if he was here, I'd make fun of him. But it's his presentation. I will give it with full love and appreciation. We wanted to do more of an apples-to-apples comparison. So we divided the root CAs into 4 tiers, according to how many certificates were anchored to each one. The giant tier 1 section of this pie represents that long tail of the previous bar graph of the 78,000. Tier 1 is a tier with the largest root CAs, where each root had 10 million certificates, and there just aren't that many in this tier, so one screenshot shows them all, 13 total. Unsurprisingly, there are no risky or really trusty outliers here. You'd expect, and you would hope, frankly, that the biggest players have their acts together, and there's probably going to be some market competition to ensure that they're all roughly in the same ballpark. For those of you in the far back who can't read the light font, places like Komodo, once again, GlobalSign, DigiCert, ECC Certificate Authority, Amazon, CyberTrust. Once again, you'd hope these folks are issuing with great trust, and thankfully they were. Otherwise, this would have been a much more interesting talk about how one of the largest went wrong. Tier 2, less than 1 million certificates, is also a pretty short list, 9. Probably unsurprising, not so many risky or trusty outliers. Tier 3, less than 100,000, has 11 total entries. Once again, no risky or overly trusty outliers. Now, Tier 4 is when things start to get interesting, and this is 100,000 certificates. There are 464 total Tier 4 roots. By the Z-score, the most risky is ISRG root X2, which, as we said, is used by Let's Encrypt, but only has 2 certs. So let's just throw that outlier out and discard it. In this tier, and as I said, this is only looking at the data with no context to name or blame or anything like that. But eMudhar Technologies, which says they're largest certifying authority in India. SSL Corporation runs SSL.com, and though 2 of them are shown here, only 1 is a risky outlier. I'm not sure if it's super important, but one of the CAs they use for regular SSL certificates, as opposed to the extended validation certificates, which is kind of like the Twitter blue of TLS certificates, which I'm surprised that comment is still accurate, because we wrote this like 2 months ago, and we both said, is Twitter still going to be around? But anyway, there we go. Twitter blue. Twitter blue for certificates. eTurga Certification Authority is run by, not surprisingly, eTurga. Once again, I really think these certificate authorities need to talk to a better marketing department, if I'm honest. But they're a PKI company based out of Turkey. To me, the real surprise here, which we were not expecting, was the Google Trust Services. This CA issues certificates for end users. And maybe it's not a huge surprise, because these aren't being given to companies, they're given to specific people. Even though they're in a tier 4 in terms of size, it's mostly self-generated, user-generated content, and so that makes sense why there might be a 21% malicious site signed by that CA, which is a pretty high number. It's worth pointing out, even though there are risky outliers, once again, my legal department and myself cannot be more clear. I'm not saying any of these are inherently untrustworthy. I'm just saying this is the data that we're seeing today. And with many things in cybersecurity, you're going to have to make your own decisions based on the data for your trust level and your own threat model. Although there were a few risky outliers, there weren't any trusty outliers, probably due to the long tail CAs that only have a few certificates and no malicious observations like these above. Once again, a pie chart, David. I did the same sort of analysis on the issuing CAs. The tier boundaries are different than the ones I used for the root CAs, but the general shape of distribution is the same. The giant tier 1 part of this pie is the long tail of issuers with very few certificates, usually exactly one, which is kind of interesting that you have issuers that are just issuing one certificate. The tier 1 issuers, which once again is less than 100,000 certificates, had two risky outliers, GoDaddy and ZeroSSL. ZeroSSL had a free tier for about $10 US a month. You can get as many 90-day certificates as you want. So it makes sense they might attract more bad actors. I personally have seen a lot of campaigns that have just been up and down in 90 days. GoDaddy certificates are more costly, so I'm not sure how to explain their #1 ranking, but they are one of the largest providers of SSL certificates in the world. This is something we've seen before, and the more malicious sites they host, the more certificates they'd host for those sites, so I think this might be correlation and causation a bit. Once again, nothing against them. If you run the world's internet, you're going to see some bad stuff on it. There we go, build there. And trustiest issuers, tier 1, once again, we didn't necessarily see anyone a lot of trust, which kind of works. We're looking for bad things. So, for tier 2 issuers, less than 10,000 certificates, there's only one big outlier, TrustOcean Encryption 365. This is one of the several issuers run by TrustOcean, which appears to be a Chinese company. Their website didn't respond during my research, so it's unclear if they're actually still in business or not, especially since their GitHub repos have been inactive for almost 2 years. However, it is a very strong outlier compared to its peers. There we go, #1 up top there. And again, not surprisingly, and I think you'll see this theme, no trusty outliers. We're able to see untrusty things much easier than we are able to see trusty. Tier 3 issuers, less than 1,000 certificates, have several risky outliers, including 2 of the Imudera technology issuers associated with that risky root CA we saw earlier. DigiCert was a bit of a surprise, to be honest, since they're a very well-established CA, but this is only one of several issuers they run, so it could have just been a bad batch of an adversary choosing to use that issuer for some malicious things. And the rapid SSL service is not very expensive, or is not inexpensive compared to their peers. So once again, the problem with sometimes research is I don't have the context to know why this comes as bad. We just know it is by comparison of other people. And again, no one was super trusty. So lots of noise here for tier 4. None of these even look like valid results, given they all have less than 10 certificates. And no especially trusty issuers, probably once again, do that large tail. So some conclusions. I always like to end a little early, especially on the last day. I'm sure you're all as tired as I am, and if you ever want to get a bio break in, it's nice to get out a little bit earlier, so we'll probably wrap up a bit early. But interestingly, though we identified a total of 10 risky outlier root CAs and ignored all the tier 4 CAs because they drowned in the noise, we identified no trusty outliers. However, most of the root CAs did seem extremely trustworthy. So if you're tempted to block the risky roots and remove them from the trusty root store, you can do this, but you'd probably want to figure out why any of your users are using the certificates that were signed. This could be a fun research project on its own. It's something David's looking into, but it may be more trouble than it's worth for most organizations. One aspect we tried to do at the end of this was say, okay, what can you do with this information? And when we started talking to customers at Splunk and organizations that run network defense, blocking issuers or CAs within their network is actually kind of a hard proposition. There's not necessarily a lot of technologies that allow you to do that. You can detect them. You can use Zeek or you can use other technologies to actually extract SSL certificates and get some of the issuer's information, but actually doing active blocks a little bit harder. Once again, though, if you do see this as value, you should make your own risk decisions here and see if the effort justifies the rewards. Room for future work. David, like I said, is kind of looking at extending this research a bit. A longer certificate history, a longer intel would give us more ability to find things, which could be really interesting. We went back 2 years. The precise subject matching, as we said, that is really loosey-goosey. You would expect, thanks to the glory of IETF and RFCs, that this would be better matched, but we did have some problems making sure that they were all in the right place. Nothing to do with the data that we were provided, just literally how the internet works, which is kind of a terrifying thing, that how loose the internet works in the long run. We think it's a wonderful opportunity for any organizations out there that do threat intel to actually provide and track malicious certificates. Obviously, there's things like the SSL block list from abuse.ch. Some of the partners we have do this as well, but I think there's an opportunity to expand that. And we think that people should compute and publish CA risk rankings on a regular basis. So David wanted me to challenge if there's any threat intel providers in the room right now. If you're a customer, you should go ask for this feature. We'd love to see it. We think it's something that folks could do. So one of the big things at RSA, obviously, is making sure that you have value out of coming to a talk like this. I actually really like the method that RSA does of making sure you have something for today, tomorrow, and later on. So in this case, we decided to do days, weeks, and months. Download all the CA risk rankings. So it looks like, that's fun. Okay, slightly old deck that I missed one slide on. We do actually have published, good English here. We have published all of our data, all the synthesized data. We didn't publish any of the data from our providers, but we did publish the data that was actually synthesized in terms of our results, and we've released this on GitHub. I will tweet this out directly after this talk. You can find me at MeanSec, which is just, I'm average at security, and I'm also slightly sarcastic, so MEANSEC. I'll publish that out. David Bianco, I'll have Splunk retweet it as well, but you'll be able to get the link for all of the SSL data that we actually went through on this project. If you're not logging TLS certificates, I really think you should. Not only for this project, but like I said, pivoting on SSL certificates is one of the most incredible ways to find adversaries. There's a lot of good documentation. Mark Parsons, who's over at Mystic, or I guess that's Microsoft Threat Intelligence now, has had several great projects on it. I've spoken about it and written some blogs as well. For the weeks, start thinking about how to do HTTPS-focused threat hunting. We've given a lot of options here, a lot of areas to start focusing on. I think you could look at some of these issuers. If you had Emu-Kader in your environment, you might want to ask why. We didn't see any real good reasons why people should be connecting to those, and I think it'd be interesting to know why your organization is by comparison. And finally, as David said, a call to action for CTI vendors to make their CA risk rankings part of their regular Surface offering. Some do, and we'd love to see more. We think there's a lot of value there, and we think there's a really rich data set that people can utilize. So with that, my name is not David Bianco, it's Ryan Kovar, Distinguished Security Strategist at Splunk. I run a research team called Surge, and I'm very proud to present on my team's work. Happy to answer any questions if I'm able to. Wow, he didn't even get through the question. It was that good, he got applause. It's just, cheers.
I have two related questions. First, I haven't seen a name of Let's Encrypt in any of your lists. Can you say why?
Yeah.
Oh, so that's Let's
The
Encrypt.
ISRG is the Let's Encrypt for what we would see visualized.
Yeah. Second, I think that, I want to doubt your methodology because
I appreciate that in front of a conference.
Essentially what you are implying is that some CAs are doing a better job and some CAs are doing a worse job. So for example, if you would look at sloppy issued certificates, like how many certificates are revoked because they validate badly the credentials of the companies, that would be very relevant. But what you essentially are checking is how sloppy are their customers. So obviously,
Correct.
If you have somebody who is giving certificates for free, then more price-sensitive people would go for Let's Encrypt, and even not price-sensitive people. And maybe like if you just compare the cost of the certificate, I would see a correlation of companies that have more money. They probably get more expensive certificates that also apply better practices for their websites, so therefore they're compromised less frequently versus companies that are like whatever, private websites or companies with low budget.
Very reasonable question.
But my point is that this information by itself doesn't bear anything in terms of reputation of the CAs if this is how you measure it. That's what I'm trying to say.
What I would push back on, although I do recognize your point, and I do agree with it actually, we're looking more at adversary behavior. So less about how good or bad a CA is for how they're maintaining their own, but the behavior of adversaries and what they're picking and what you can infer from that as a network defender. So I don't actually care how a certificate authority personally is dealing with the reputation side of it. What I care perhaps is APT 29 is focusing on using only a single issuer, or they're going into there. And then as a network defender, can I make an outcome?
But then I think you have an assumption that the bad guys are the ones that are buying CA certificates. I would presume that this actually the situation is different. So normal people are buying certificates, and then bad guys are compromising their website. So they compromise whatever website they would get to. So you see through threat intel those certificates, but most of them is not the bad guys who bought them, rather than people who owned compromised websites.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. That's a very good point. Any other questions? Yeah.
Maybe I missed it. How did you classify a risky
Sure. I think I glossed over that a bit. So what we went for risky was 185 million domains from the providers who had classified those as bad. So the risky behavior was these are bad domains and these are the certificates associated with those domains.
Got it.
FQDS.
And any interpretation of the number of routes that are provided with a browser? Can you
I
extrapolate
know
any of
David went into
data as
that,
to
but
why?
I'll have to get your name and follow up on that. David did look at that, but I don't have that in my notes.
Thanks.
But that's a good question. Great. Like I said, I'm happy to pass any more detailed questions, and actually the feedback you have would be wonderful for David to hear as well in person, but I'm going to send it over. So if I can get that information, I'd love to, because that's some good work. Thank you all for coming very much, especially on the third day. I know it's a late one, and hope you have a great flights back, and enjoy the rest of the week. Thank you.